If you're the parent of an autistic tween, there is a good chance that sex ed feels a bit heavier. Just awkward, not just easy to put off, but heavier. Because for a lot of parents, it does not just feel like, okay, I need to talk about puberty and bodies and consent. It feels more like, what if I get this wrong? What if I say too much? What if I make them curious about something that they weren't even thinking about yet, like porn? What if they're more vulnerable? And what if people judge them? What if people judge me? And pressure, it can get big really fast. And I see this all the time with parents of autistic kids. There can be this extra layer of fear, responsibility, and urgency that sits on top of the normal discomfort people feel around sex ed. And honestly, it makes sense. When your child's autistic, you're often already carrying a lot, and you're used to thinking ahead, and you're used to trying to protect them. And you're also used to worrying about how other people might misunderstand them as well. And you're used to knowing that the world does not always meet autistic kids with the care, clarity, and safety that they actually deserve. So, of course, sex ed can feel loaded. And one thing I know for sure is this: parent anxiety can quietly get in the way of these conversations, not because parents don't care, but because they care deeply. But when fear is running the show, parents often do one of three things: they delay, they rush, or they go silent. And none of those usually help. In this episode, I'm going to walk you through why parents of autistic tweens often feel more anxious about sex ed, what those fears usually sound like, and how that anxiety can block the very conversations that your child needs. And stay with me, because at the end, I'll give you a 1-minute challenge to help you spot the fear that is most likely to stop you from talking. What if talking to your tween about sex felt cringe-free and more natural? Welcome to Sex Ed for Tween Parents, where sex ed stays real. This season, we're focusing on autistic tween and what helps sex ed actually land. I'm CATH HAKANSON, sex educator, autistic ADHD mum, and I'm here to help you move from panic and pressure to sex ed that's just bloody effective. The first thing I want to say is this: if sex ed feels more emotionally loaded when your child's autistic, you're not imagining that. A lot of parents, they do feel more anxious, and usually it's not because they're being dramatic or overthinking it. It's because the stakes just feel higher. They're not just thinking about puberty or consent or bodies. They're thinking about safety, vulnerability, and misunderstanding, judgment, shame, risk. And when all of that gets tangled together, sex ed, it can stop feeling like something you teach little by little and actually start feeling like this huge thing that you could mess up. And this is where a lot of parents get stuck: the fear of getting it wrong. And look, this is probably the biggest one. Parents worry that they'll explain something badly or use the wrong words, say too much, say too little, start too early or start too late. And when your child's autistic, that fear can get even louder, because you might already know that vague language does not work well for them. And you might know already that they take things literally. And you might also already know that timing with your child matters. And also with your child, that once something lands, it can land very strongly. So instead of thinking, I'll just bring it up and see how it goes, you think, I need to do this properly. And that sounds responsible. But sometimes what properly turns into is actually pressure. Pressure to get it perfect, and pressure to know exactly what to say. Pressure to have every answer ready for their questions. And that pressure can actually stop parents from saying anything at all. So I want to be really clear here. You do not need to do sex ed perfectly to do it well. And you do not need the perfect words. And you do not need one perfect moment. And you do not need to sound like a textbook at all. You just need to be clear, calm, and willing to start. Because waiting until you feel ready, that can become a very long way. And then there's another fear that sits right alongside that one: the fear of saying too much or triggering their curiosity. A lot of parents worry that if they bring something up, that they'll put ideas in their child's head. They worry that naming something will trigger their child's curiosity and that explaining masturbation will make it happen more, that talking about sex will make their child want sex, and mentioning porn will somehow send them looking for it. And again, when your child's autistic, that fear can feel even bigger because as parents, you may already worry about intense interests, literal thinking, or their child getting stuck on a topic. So they think, maybe I should just not say anything until I absolutely have to. The problem with that is kids do not grow up in a vacuum. Your child is still living in a world where they'll hear things, notice things, see things, feel things, and wonder things. The question is not whether curiosity will exist. It will. The question is whether your child gets clear information from you or confusing information from somewhere else. And this is where anxiety can really distort things because parents start treating information like it's dangerous, when actually, for autistic kids especially, clear information is often protective. Not huge amounts of information, not a lecture and not an information dump, but clear, calm, honest information. That is very different because there's a big difference between flooding a child with too much and then giving a child the information that they actually need. And when parents are scared of saying too much, they sometimes end up saying almost nothing. Which brings us to the next fear. Fear that their child will be vulnerable or misunderstood. Now, this one runs deep. A lot of parents of autistic tweens, they carry a real fear that their child will be more vulnerable. And I get it, I'm a parent myself. And they also have a fear that their child is more likely to be misunderstood, to miss a cue, more likely to be taken advantage of, and more likely to freeze, and more likely to be judged unfairly. And some of that fear comes from real things you've already seen. And you may already have seen people misread your child. And you may already know what it's like for their behaviour to be interpreted through the wrong lens. And you may already know how quickly autistic kids can be blamed for things that are actually about confusion, overload, or mismatch. So when sex ed comes up, it can hit a nerve because you're not just teaching information, you're also trying to protect them from a world that does not always understand them. And again, that makes sense, but here's the catch. When fear gets too big, parents can slide into panic and they start thinking, we need to deal with this right now. I need to make sure they understand every risk immediately. I need to stop anything going wrong. And that urgency, it can backfire because when fear is driving, parents often either come in too hard, talk too much, or make the whole topic feel scary. And that's when kids can shut down, pull away, or stop bringing things to you to talk about. And there's also another place here that does not get talked about enough. And that's fear of the behaviour being judged by other people. A lot of parents are not just scared of what their child might do. They're also scared of how other people will interpret it. So if their child talks too openly, if they ask direct questions, if they misunderstand a rule, if they touch their genitals in the wrong setting, if they say something blunt, or if their behaviour gets seen through a sexualised or judgmental lens. And that fear is real because autistic kids are often given much less room to be misunderstood safely. And parents know that. So sometimes they start trying to prevent judgment before anything has even happened. I know I do myself as a parent sometimes. And they can become hyper alert and we over explain and clamp down early, or parents avoid the conversation altogether because it feels too loaded. But sex ed taught through fear, it doesn't create safety, usually creates shame. And shame actually makes kids less likely to ask questions. They're less likely to disclose and less likely to come back when they need your help. So if you've noticed yourself feeling anxious, avoidant, urgent, or a bit panicky around these topics, that doesn't mean that you're failing. It actually means that you care and your nervous system's probably trying to protect both you and your child. But trying to protect them is not always the same as teaching in a helpful way. And this is the bit I really want you to hold on to. You do not need to do this perfectly, and you do not need to get rid of all your fear before you start. And you also don't need to become totally relaxed about sex ed overnight. And you don't need to have every possible scenario sorted out in your head. What you do need, though, is to notice when fear is starting to run the conversation. Because once you can spot that, you can stop letting it make all the decisions. And that is when sex ed starts to get easier. Not because the risks disappear, but because you are no longer teaching from panic. You're teaching from clarity. And if you're listening and thinking, okay, Kath, yeah, that's me, but how do I actually start without overthinking it? That is exactly where I want to help. So if this episode has you thinking, okay, I can see that fear has been a big part of why I've delayed this or rushed it or gone quiet, and you want help making sex ed feel clearer and more doable, that is exactly why I created my neuro-affirming sex ed guide. It's designed to help you teach bodies, puberty, privacy, consent, boundaries, and safety in ways that are clear, practical, and easier for neurodivergent kids to process. So instead of trying to figure it all out on your own or waiting until you magically feel more confident, you've got something solid to work from. If that sounds like what you need, you can go and grab it at neuro-affirmingsexed.com or just click the link in the show notes, because you do not need more pressure. You actually need support that fits your child and you. Here's the 1-minute challenge for today. Name the fear that is most likely to stop you talking. Just one. Maybe the fear is I'll get it wrong, I'll say too much, I'll make them curious, they'll be more vulnerable, other people will judge them, I don't know how to do this safely. Just name it. You don't need to fix it today, and you don't need to solve it. Just name it, because once you can name that fear, it stops quietly running the show in the background. And that matters because fear does really well in the background when you don't name it. But when you do name it, you can actually start working with it instead of being driven by it. And that is when a change happens or starts. And thanks for joining me for this episode of Sex Ed for Tween Parents. And if this episode helped, I'd love it if you left a quick review. It helps more parents find the podcast and feel less alone in all of this. And don't forget to grab that Neuro-Affirming Sex Ed guide at neuro-affirmingsexed.com, or it'll be in the show notes. Next episode, we're going to be talking about why one big sex talk usually backfires with autistic tweens and what works better instead. See you next time.